Welcome, everyone, to the Wyoming Institute for Humanities Research Think and Drink series of virtual talks. We hope you are as well and healthy as you can possibly be, given the truly crazy state of the world in which we live. I'm Scott Hinkle. I'm the director of the Wyoming Institute for Humanities Research, and it is my great joy to welcome you tonight. Many of the talks that we've given over the past couple of weeks have been keenly relevant to our world at the moment, and I predict this one will be the exact same thing. So in just a moment, I'm going to introduce you to our moderator, who will then, in turn, introduce you to our speakers. But a couple of technical notes. If you wish, up here in your Zoom screen, you have a button that either says Speaker View or Gallery View. If you want to see all the speakers at the same time, you toggle to Gallery View. And if you just want to see one big picture of whoever's speaking at a given time, you click to Speaker View. You can do that. Down over here, you have a button for Q&A or chat. If you wish, you can send a message in the chat to all the panelists and all the attendees, and everyone present will see it. Alternatively, you can send a message through the Q&A, which is right next to it. And that, if you type into the Q&A, that will come just to the panelists and speakers. So you may choose your method of communication. This summer, we are hosting these Think and Drink events every other week. So please join us 2 weeks from tonight if you're with us live. I also want to say, we have a mailing list for folks if you want to keep in touch with us and get good information about when and what these will be. You can just send an email to humanities@uwyo.edu. humanities@uwyo.edu. I'll also type that into the chat in just a second after I go off screen. You can just send us an email, and then we will add you to our email list, and then you can keep up with us.
And if you're also really good, you can send a message directly from your brain to Scott's email, and he will forward the question to us.
Exactly right. Exactly right.
Yeah. Okay.
My receptors are in my glasses. That's how it. This is going to be a fun one, folks. So you can also see the past recordings of our other Think and Drink talks. If you go to YouTube and just search for Wyoming Institute for Humanities Research, you can see all of our previous talks. And you'll be able to find this one tomorrow or the next day, maybe, depending on the labor of our very intrepid graduate student. Okay, so it is my great joy to introduce you to Dr. Ken Giroux, who is a member of the Institute Steering Committee, who will be our moderator tonight and who will introduce our panelists. Welcome.
Bye-bye, Scott.
Scott.
Thanks, Scott.
Thank you.
So those of you who are here, I presume you've seen our advertising for it, so you know something already of who David and Betsy are. But I do want to say that a large impetus for this particular conversation have been 2 books, one from each of them. And I'll start with the older book. It's this one, Spillover, that David published in 2012, if I'm correct. And he's a science writer, and so he spent 2 or 3 years, I suspect, some of it traveling around the world, working with, interviewing 5 years, there you go, interviewing epidemiologists and ecologists in all around the world, trying to learn more about how this sort of thing happens. Spillover, of course, referencing the spillover of viruses from one part of the animal kingdom to our part of the animal kingdom. And the book, being carefully researched, easily predicts our current moment, not necessarily the timing of it. David's an exquisite writer, and he's one of the few writers whose words I read slowly so I can enjoy them. David, I wasn't sure until I saw you just now with your COVID haircut. I wasn't sure who is that on the front. Is it a selfie or is it somebody else?
Yeah, I've had to deal with that too. Sometimes if my photo has been put up along with the book jacket, and I always say, well, I'm the one on the left. That's a vivid cover. No, it's not a selfie. No.
Thank you. And the second book, more recent, American Zion. I'll read the subtitle, Cliven, Bundy, God, and Public Lands in the West. Betsy is a historian and a writer, and also a very graceful and wonderful writer, easy to read, great storytellers, both of them. And her book talks about the history of, leading up to this current moment, of people who live in the West who have rather strong feelings about their rights to their land, not necessarily in agreement with the rest of the country and their view of whose land it is and what can be done on it. And so those two stories, you might think of this ecological phenomena of spillover and this more cultural phenomena of land issues in the West as being somewhat disconnected, but of course they come together in this current moment in a pretty profound way, which I'll leave for this conversation to explore. So Betsy and David, if we start, I mean, maybe I've introduced you fully enough, but if you want to say a word or two, either or both of you, on what you might head into tonight, and when you think you're done, I will start by asking questions.
Well, we have done several of these paired conversations because Betsy's book was published very recently in March, late March, and of course her book, her publisher, Torrey House Press, planned a book tour for her, and then comes COVID-19, so there are no book tours, there are no events that involve people gathering, and we started doing some virtual book store events on Zoom, talking about the overlap between our two books, mine published 8 years ago and hers published 2 months ago, and the overlap zone that involves science and the rejection of science, conspiracy theories, and the toxic effect of conspiracy theories on democracy and on doing things like taking care of our public lands and taking care of our public health. And that's where the overlap is, right?
Yeah, exactly. We thought that it might be interesting to look at the themes that are so sort of to wrap together in this particular moment. My book is on Cliven, Bundy, and the agitating that they have been doing in the West. I talk about the history. It's based on Mormon prophecy. It's based on Mormon history. And as we get to a moment of time that seems rather apocalyptic to some people, the idea of Ammon Bundy, who took over the Oregon Wildlife Refuge, Cliven Bundy, who is his father, who was involved in an armed standoff in Nevada. This is over liberties. This has been prophesized, they believe, by early Mormon revelation. And I thought that this pandemic was going to trigger some of that reaction. So I actually called Ammon Bundy in March, who is now in Idaho, to ask how he would react to the pandemic restrictions. And I can talk more about that, but I knew that this would be a cause for agitating. I knew that the pandemic, the swirl of misinformation, the pile of conspiracies was very much a worldview that they hold. And so I said to David, wouldn't it be interesting if we talked about the overlap right now? And then we started to do, with independent bookstores, we started to talk about it.
Can I add one thing?
Of course.
Because, we hope that we're reaching people outside of Wyoming, outside of Montana and Wyoming. Some people might not remember why Cliven Bundy is a notorious man. He was a rancher in Nevada who went 20 years without paying his grazing fees to the BLM. They came to confiscate his cows, and that's when the armed standoff occurred in 2014.
2014.
The Battle of Bunkerville.
And then the takeover of the Wildlife Refuge in 2016. So that's what American Zion focuses on, the history of that movement, starting with Joseph Smith, who was the first prophet of the Mormon Church, and then this sort of all the anti-science and the conspiracy,
anti-science and anti-federal power
right, the
resistance.
anti-government, and then Spillover, you should tell them what that's about, because that's an incredibly important book at this moment.
I'm inclined to toss it back to Ken for at this moment. And I've talked a little bit about Spillover. It's about this moment. It's about the emergence of new diseases that have the potential to become pandemics, emerging from non-human animals and getting into humans. That's what the title refers to, spillover. That's the moment when a pathogen, such as a virus or a bacterium, passes from its non-human animal host into its first human victim. And then if it spreads from one human to another, that becomes an outbreak. We have outbreaks of Ebola periodically in Central Africa. Usually they can be controlled before they become epidemics. But in 2014, we had an Ebola epidemic in 3 West African countries. And sometimes it's worse than that if the virus is not only new, but extremely transmissible, pathogenic. And so we have COVID-19 now. And we have problems with rejection of science at the highest levels of our government, rejection of science. So rejection of science with detriment to the public lands of Americans and the public health of Americans and people all over the world is, as we said, one of the zones of overlap.
I'll pose my first question, but first, to return to the start of our conversation, I just received an email from a primate expert named Jenna Hickey, who tells me that that's a mandrill on the front cover.
It is a mandrill. It is a slightly exaggerated mandrill.
Of course.
And the jacket was done by a great New York artist, jacket artist named Chip Kidd. Mm-hmm. Famous guy. We were lucky to get him, I guess, to do that. And when I saw that jacket, my publisher was very excited about it. And the first thing I thought was, oh my God, what is our friend Jane Goodall going to think about this? This lurid demonization of a perfectly reasonable primate.
Right, of course. So coming at this current moment from both of your directions, there's a certain propensity and a certain proportion of our the population of this country to believe in political conspiracies, and that's not, of course, just restricted to the pandemic and the land situation. But is that motivation, that desire, that willingness to believe in conspiracies coming from the same place as those who believe, for example, there are some people who believe, or at least we've heard that the virus was engineered, that it was somehow imposed on us by people trying to get control over us?
You want me to start this?
Yeah.
So yes, so there are these rumors, conspiracy theories about the very origin of this virus. This virus is 96% similar to a bat virus that was discovered in a cave in China 5 years ago by a team at the Wuhan Institute of Virology, 96% similar. It contains elements in it that are similar to pangolin genomes, so it seems to have been a mix, but the authoritative evolutionary virologists say this is not an engineered virus. This is a virus produced by natural selection, good old-fashioned Darwinian natural selection coming out of animals. And secondly, the notion that this possibly leaked from a laboratory at the Wuhan Institute of Virology. That's an accusation that has been tossed around on the web, and there is zero evidence for it. There's zero evidence for it. This is not the exact virus that Dr. Zhengli Shi was working on in her laboratory. So that's another, it's a mere accusation, but that's a story that has a narrative pungency. And that's, I think, one of the things that conspiracy theories have in common, one with another, in terms of their appeal, especially their appeal to certain people who feel resentful of authority and left out, disempowered, left behind economically. There's a tendency to grab onto stories that are more interesting and more pungent and more in line with their political biases than reality. regardless of what the evidence may say. And that goes to all kinds of conspiracies. Conspiracies about the origins of this virus, conspiracies about what the federal government is doing in terms of public lands. People want to believe crazy stories because lives can sometimes be dull, and crazy stories bring a little bit of sugar, a little bit of spice to lives.
Yeah, I would add to that. Conspiracy right now in our country is being espoused by the highest levels. So when we first started hearing about this disease, we heard it was a hoax, and or it wasn't a big deal. It wasn't any worse than the flu. These are things coming from our president. And we have a culture that is very conspiracy inclined, that listens to everything Donald Trump says. And if he's espousing conspiracy theories, they're believing them. So right now we're in the middle of a dangerous situation. And I would say when I talked to Ammon Bundy, he said,
Ammon is Cliven's son.
Ammon Bundy is Cliven's son, and I talked to him in March, and he said he didn't think it was a hoax, but he thought that the numbers were being inflated, that the mortality rate is a lie. So conspiracy is possible because of a number of conditions. Number one, a deep mistrust of science. Number two, a deep mistrust of the government. Number three, there's a real, in terms of a culture that's anxious and anxiety, anxious cultures are more inclined to believe conspiracies because it makes more sense. And then disease is something that we can't see. It's not happening the same way, say, in New York City that it is in the West. Montana and Wyoming have relatively low rates of COVID. So it's much easier to think it's a hoax or it's a falsehood, or excuse me, a hoax or it's exaggerated in this particular environment with those particular components.
Yeah, more difficult if you lived in New York City too.
Right. Yeah, I mean, you know, because these people, in at least the ones I'm tracking right now, they're not living in New York City. They're living in rural areas.
And we need to remember that, you know, something like 41 or 43% of the American public still, according to Gallup polls over decades, reject the idea that the human species is a result of evolution. 41 to 43 or 44% reject evolution of humans. So there is a great resistance to science, and there is this desire for more interesting stories. Can I briefly tell you one of my favorite crazy, it's not conspiracy, but crazy theories that people embraced, Ken? I was remembering this late last night. There was an astronomer in Boston, late 19th, early 20th century, Percival Lowell. And he was a wealthy man, and he got his own telescope made, a fancy telescope in Arizona. And he started looking at Mars, and he picked up on the idea that Mars is covered with very carefully linear irrigation canals, that there was a society on Mars that was in desperate straits, and it was draining meltwater from the polar caps in northern and southern Mars, supposedly to irrigate the desert of Mars. And he was looking through his telescope. He was drawing pictures of this. There are canals on Mars, canals on Mars. And people said, well, there are canals on Mars. There's civilization on Mars. And this idea spread because it had appeal. It was more interesting and more fun than daily working lives. And then eventually people got better telescopes, and they looked and they saw there are no canals on Mars. He had a bad lens. He was hallucinating. He was seeing what he wanted to see. It wasn't there. And what he wanted to see, people wanted to believe.
Well, and I'm not sure it's just more fun. I mean, you talked about the evolution issue, that 40% of the people in the country don't believe in evolution. I think there's an aversion to, in that case, believing that we weren't created in the image of God. So we have this, you know, religious fundamentalism that goes with it.
That's right.
And again, I'll go back to the anxiety. 40% of the population right now, or maybe even more than that, believe that a vaccine will come with a chip that will track your movements. So there's
40%?
40%, or no, 40% of Republicans.
Okay.
So that's different. But 40% of Republicans believe that with the vaccine for COVID, you will get microchipped.
Yeah.
So there's this enormous anxiety, this fear that, and it's it goes with conspiracy. And forgive me, our dog keeps bringing my shoes in and chewing on them. So if he's a little distracting.
Here's the Bundy family represent in some way a large-ish number of generations of an echo of circumstances in the mid 1800s, late 1800s in what was then Utah territory, and that speaks to the idea that cultural norms, whatever they may be, for good or ill, stick around perhaps long after they've had their utility or their moment of genesis. Can you maybe, Betsy, first talk about that?
Yeah, I can if you get my shoe away from Manny. He's destroyed so many of them. Yes, that's a really interesting point. And what I talk about with the Bundys, I as I said, I went to, or maybe I didn't say this, I went to visit the Bundys the year after they had the standoff in Nevada. And that was in 2015. And I talked to them about their religious beliefs. I was in the middle of my dissertation. I was doing it on Mormon settlement and how Mormon settlement inspired land use wars in this particular area, which was southern Utah and southern Nevada. And so I hadn't really put together how much their war, and they will call it their religious war, is based on early church ideology. And so they told me about a man named Nephi Johnson, who is Cliven Bundy's spiritual great-grandfather, which means that Nephi Johnson adopted Johnny Jensen, who is Cliven Bundy's grandfather, because Nephi Johnson, his second or third wife, was Cliven Bundy's great-grandmother. And so by researching Nephi Johnson, I went back to because they say we're entitled to the land because of Nephi Johnson, who settled in this area. Well, Nephi Johnson bounced around, and he also was in Mexico trying to evade authorities when they were cracking down on polygamy. So they do not have, they haven't settled in the area and been in the area for that long, or for a continuum. However, a lot of the families have been in the area. And so this is a place that does have this idea of history that is passed from generation to generation to generation, because the families do stick around. And looking at the early church, there are a number of ideas that the Bundys used to justify their war. They believed that it was prophesized that Mormon people would one day rescue the Constitution as it was hanging by a thread. And that's, I think, what Ammon right now is looking at. Oh gosh, the Constitution is hanging by a thread because Governor Brad Little of Idaho has issued shelter at home orders. So he sees that his rights are hanging by a thread because we're trying to protect our communities. There's also this idea that American Zion is named after Mormon homeland, and this is a notion that the Mormon people, after being badly oppressed, and they really were, there were mobs in Missouri that were killing them, they had seen Missouri as Mormon homeland, as Zion. It was the place they believed the Garden of Eden had originally been. They were going to build there. They had to leave the state because Lilburn Boggs was the governor and issued an execution order to kill Mormons on sight. They went to Illinois, and then they were kicked out of there. Joseph Smith, well, he was murdered, and there was once again mob outrage. They went to the Great Basin. They established homeland there. And because Joseph Smith had promised them homeland, they believed that they'd finally established it. So the idea of the federal government managing public lands in this region is absolutely an antithesis of what they see as their land. This is they're entitled to it. It's something that they've fought hard for. And so when Cliven goes out and has these battles, he's battling for reasons that have been around since the beginning of the church.
Ken, I want to follow that with a question back to you. Do you think that some of these ideas and some of this ethos adheres to geography as well as to religion?
Well, I think those ideas develop in a certain geography, and then they retain their spirit because people tend to be more or less local across time. So there are, I guess it was Malcolm Gladwell in one of his books spoke to the idea that cultural norms in what we call the American South, Appalachia, northern Florida, Georgia, the Carolinas, and so on. The people who settled there were hill people, largely from Scotland and Ireland, and hill people were cattle farmers, cattle who they might have 2 cows and a pig or some small, not large herds like we think of them, and their lives depended on protecting other people, protecting their animals, whereas farmers from more lowland who grew crops per se, I couldn't kill your family by stealing some of your corn. I could wipe out your family if I stole your cow. And so different sort of approaches to the world, the honor, response to lock and load and, develop them because of the necessity of it, because of how they lived. But some of that ethos is still present in a geographical region in the country many generations later, echoes of that older one. And in that case, maybe it's totally historical, not relevant to the current world, but that you learn from your parents, you learn from your parents, you learn from your parents. It's there all the way through.
Yeah.
It's interesting that Betsy, you mentioned that Ammon Bundy's contention that the Constitution is hanging by a thread might have greater resonance currently than just among that particular group of people for different reasons. There may be lots of people in this country right now thinking, holy man, we might be hanging on by a thread in terms of, and that's just an interesting side.
No,
Yes,
and
yes,
I
right.
actually, that's a really good point, because when I was talking to Ammon and he was saying, I'm so worried the government is going to use COVID to consolidate power, I said, I am too. And I think it was the only time I've ever agreed with him. I'm not worried about the stay-at-home orders. Obviously, I understand that how pandemics work, and I believe the statistics. But I'm worried about elections. I'm worried about the Department of Justice asking Congress if they can arrest people, hold them indefinitely without habeas corpus, because that's happened. I'm worried about the deregulations, although that's the unraveling of law.
Sure.
So no, that, I mean, believe me, when I talk to him, I don't agree with him on very much, but I agree with him on that.
It reminds me a little bit of 1971 and 72, only it's worse. And he's worse than Nixon. And I trust that we're all agreed that if he starts talking about postponing or canceling the November election, we'll all meet in the streets of Washington, D.C., just the way we did in 1969.
With masks.
With masks.
And 6 feet apart.
6 feet apart, yeah. A mass mobilization with social distancing, yeah.
But we'll show up.
We got to show up.
Here's a nerdy question for you, David. Even so, people who believe in the science and believe that the COVID is not being exaggerated and so on, I often see references to, with great fear behind them, mutant strains of the virus. And I wish to make the point to the audience before you answer that it's my view that you, David, and sorry, Betsy, you and I are all mutants from a genetic point of view.
Mutation, anytime a creature's cells replicate themselves, there's a chance for mutations. And viruses replicate themselves very quickly, so viruses are continually mutating. It's a truism.
Sure.
Bacteria, when they replicate themselves, mutate, but viruses mutate more. And single-stranded RNA viruses is a particular kind of virus. They have a particular kind of genome, one strand of the molecule RNA instead of a double strand of the molecule DNA. One strand replicating itself makes more mistakes. This coronavirus is a single-stranded RNA virus, as all coronaviruses are. So to say that it's mutating is a truism. Yes, it's always mutating. Most of those mutations get thrown off sideways, and those particular viral lineages don't survive because usually mutations cause harm. Some of them do survive, so the virus might gradually change. A virus sampled from the first patient in Wuhan in December might be different in its genome from a virus sampled from a person in Seattle in February, which might be different from a person sampled in New York in April. But what the evolutionary virologists are saying is that, yeah, this virus is mutating. Of course it's mutating, but it's not changing very much. It's not evolving very much. It's not heading off in new directions. So the tree of life for these various different strains of this virus looks like a Lombardy poplar. We all know what a Lombardy poplar is, right? You know, it's all straight up and down with limbs sort of parallel to one another. There's not much divergence. And why is that? The scientists that I trust are saying the likely reason is that viruses evolve in different directions when they need to for evolutionary success, good old Darwinian natural selection. This virus is already so successful in humans, it doesn't need to evolve. It doesn't need to change. There's no reason for it to become more virulent because it's Darwinian mandate, I won't say its purpose because it doesn't have purpose, but its Darwinian mandate is to replicate itself abundantly and extend itself in space and time. And it's doing that blissfully right now. There's no need for it to change. When we get a vaccine, there will be need for it to change, and then it might evolve.
And it's also my understanding that viruses tend to slowly, also, if this is the right word, attenuate, because the ones that are more successful in passing themselves, their genome along, are ones that don't kill their victims instantly.
This is a common idea, but it's not universally true. It's not a principle that
Interesting.
you can count on. No, viruses do not naturally attenuate as they spread. They do that in some cases. They don't necessarily attenuate to the least virulent form. We know this. I describe this in my book, Spillover, with the virus, the myxoma virus, introduced to try and kill off the plague of rabbits in Australia. It was this very lethal virus for the rabbits that had been introduced to Australia. I think they were South American rabbits, and they just went everywhere. There was a plague of rabbits in the early 20th century. Somebody got the idea of introducing a viral pathogen, and it was like a natural experiment, and they could watch the virus kill off these rabbits. And the virus was evolving because it was in a zillion different rabbits and was replicating constantly. So the virus was mutating, the virus was evolving. It went from being very virulent to being less virulent to being hardly virulent at all. But the most successful strain was not the strain that was hardly virulent at all. The most successful strain was the strain that was kind of virulent. And it was transmitting from one rabbit to another. It was killing rabbits, but not killing them as quickly and as totally as the most virulent strain. So it's a matter of what's most successful. Sometimes people say that the first principle of a parasite, which viruses are in a sense, is don't kill your host. And that's not true. That's a misunderstanding. The first principle of a successful parasite is don't kill off your host until you've had a chance to disperse into another host. But if you can disperse into another host by making this host extremely sick so that healthcare workers or other people gather around it to try and save this person, and then you transmit to all of them, that can be a very successful evolutionary strategy. In some cases, making people very sick can be a successful evolutionary strategy that will then persist in a strain of virus.
Thank you. Switching back to recent history, Betsy, in between the Nevada standoff with the ranchers and the BLM, and then the wildlife refuge in Oregon. There were protest rides in Southeast Utah. Do you know of them? And
Recapture Canyon, where they were trying to protest roadless areas, and yeah, I do.
Was that also the Bundys particularly?
Yep. It was Ryan Bundy, who is Ammon's brother and another one of Cliven's sons, and they were protesting roadless areas. It was also a guy named Phil Lyman, who is a politician down there. He's one of the county commissioners, and he has been agitating for a very long time. Again, a devout Mormon who takes some of these early church principles and makes that the basis of his protest. I think that it's interesting because I have a lot of friends who are part of their LDS, and they are huge conservationists and really love public lands and love the landscape. But you have these pockets of rural Mormon culture that still have very, very a lot of anger, a lot of sense of entitlement to these lands. Again, going back probably to the idea that this is Mormon homeland, it's theirs. The government doesn't have any right to tell them what to do. Utah has been on the forefront of the state's rights, agitating with Nevada, and in the case of Phil Lyman and Ryan Bundy, they also, and I write about this in the book. There's a long tradition of the Mormon militia, and it starts right after these really awful attacks on Mormon people out of Missouri. People were murdered, and
brutally.
Joseph Smith put together the second largest military body in the United States behind the US Army. And it was called the Nauvoo Legion. And when they left Illinois, they brought a lot of those principles, that anger. I mean, they also had this real interest in vengeance after Joseph Smith died, and they brought that culture with them to Utah. So this military leaning, this military agitating, as I know I've said agitating a lot, but it's what they're doing, is very much part of the Mormon history. They have a long history of what has been termed by historian D. Michael Quinn military theology. So it's not unusual to see what's happening with Phil Lyman, with Ryan Bundy, with Ammon Bundy and Cliven Bundy, and many of their supporters who I talk about in the book. They're very much inspired by a militant theology, as well as some other influences. Cleon Skousen, huge conspiracy theorists, and this proliferates through these pockets.
So a lot of what seems at first glance, what the Bundys are standing up for, you might think of it as deconstructing our current system of government. What do you think they would like to see constructed? If they could actually build something or create something, as opposed to fighting the current system, so to speak. What do you think their system would look like?
That's an interesting question. And one of the things I was just reading a transcript from an interview that Ammon Bundy did with a right-wing Mormon radio and personality. And he really thinks that the West should launch a essentially secessionist movement, and to create their own government and to make it constitutional, and to do away with federal overreach. He would say he wasn't anti-government. he won't, but he has these
Understand.
notions about the Constitution that are just not true. You know, one of the things that I think about is they're always talking about we the people. You know, we the people need this, and we the people deserve that, but they don't acknowledge we the people who don't agree with them. The other thing I'd say is, to say what would the Bundys envision might be giving them more credit than they maybe deserve, because I don't think they have a vision. All they want to do right now is fight against perceived misjustice. And you know, that goes for public lands, that goes for these stay-at-home orders. They were really involved in a family called the Nickersons not that long ago, who were being evicted from their home in Idaho, and they go, and he's calling the militia and he's saying, we've got to protect these people, they're being unfairly evicted. Well, it turns out they haven't paid their mortgage in 10 years. So much of this is, and he said, okay, never mind. After I did my research, you know, stay at home. So a lot of it is very half-cocked. And I don't think there is a vision. You know, they were asked what they wanted when they took over Malheur Refuge, and it changed every day. You know, they wanted the Hammonds, and you know, the Hammonds were the family that were involved in arson, and they were given a mandatory sentence after they'd already served some time, and they were ordered back to jail. And so their first demand is get the Hammonds out of jail. And then it switches to, we want to give this land back to the ranchers, the miners, and the loggers. Well, there wasn't a tradition of, I mean, the logging operation had shut down 10 years before. The local people had a very different vision. There was a huge involvement in the Malheur management sort of routine, or the management scheme that involved the Northern Paiute, the Burns tribe. You know, this was traditional native land. It was Northern Paiute land. No consideration of that. So they do things without a historical understanding, and they do things without a game plan.
It's an inchoate rebellion.
Yeah.
I have some more questions along those lines I want to come back to, but David, some of the protesting or pushing back against stay-at-home orders and so on, I see it around me here in Wyoming, of course, and I think part of that might be because we live in a state where it's not running wild over us.
Yeah, yeah.
Are we, I guess there's probably no one answer to this, because the answer should probably properly be different in different parts of the country, but are we opening up too soon?
Well,
trying to accommodate our lives to this thing?
It's an experiment. I mean, Wyoming, certainly, and to a slightly lesser extent, Montana, are wonderful states that in which social distancing is sort of business as usual.
Yeah.
You know, we live there are not that many of us, and we tend to live far apart. And particularly rural Wyoming and rural Montana, people make their livings far apart. And so to tell them they can't make their livings now, you know, they can't go to town, they can't go to the feed store, they can't go to church, when the numbers of infected and dead are very low, is a hard sell. Meanwhile, you've got college students frolicking in the surf and on the beaches in Florida, and people going to bars in New Jersey.
And the Lake of the Ozarks. Oh my
Lake of the Ozarks,
God.
yeah.
Did you all see that? Oh, it was crazy.
So that's dangerous. And from what we know, we don't know everything about this virus. There's lots of things about this virus that remain to be learned. But from what we know so far, those are dangerous behaviors. There will be a second wave. There will be a third wave, probably. Nobody can say for sure. And those waves will kill off your grandparents, even if you feel fine. So is that okay? Is that a deal that you accept? You know, I'm talking to the young people who say, this is silly. This is invisible and therefore unreal. Let's just go about business as usual. Well, you can do that. And in some places you'll get away with that. and in other places you won't, and people will die.
But you should make the point that it's not just grandparents. I mean, they're young people who are getting it. They're young people
That's
who are
right.
being ventilated. They're young people who are dying.
That's right.
It's
Yeah.
not. I mean, that's the weird thing about this disease is it's squirrely, and we have no idea what.
For instance,
Yeah.
the countries in the world that have been hardest hit right now, the United States leading everybody. Why is that? Why? Why are we leading everybody in cases and deaths? More than 100,000 deaths. Why is that? After the US, Brazil, Spain, Italy, France, the United Kingdom, these developed countries
Russia.
with good healthcare systems, and now Russia is
Yeah.
coming up. What's going on? Well, the answer is nobody knows. Nobody knows exactly what's happening, except that this is a virus that can infect a whole lot of people and can kill a sizable fraction of the people that it infects. What's going to happen next? You know, Brazil is exploding right now. I've been doing interviews with people in Brazil because my book is just out there. Brazil is getting walloped by this right now.
And now Peru and Colombia or excuse me, Peru, Colombia, and I think Chile, no, maybe not Chile, Peru and Colombia are ratcheting up. I mean, it's really weird. And Canada's doing pretty well.
Canada's doing well. Iceland is doing well. Singapore is doing well. Singapore, of course, was lockdown efficient from the very beginning because they had the warning of SARS, but also because they are a lockdown efficient culture, Singapore. Likewise, the Republic of Korea, to a slightly lesser degree. That the point is that, and I said this, I've said this before, but you know, this is a pinball machine, and the silver ball is bouncing around, and we can nudge the machine and flap our flippers at it, but there are still 11 degrees of chance that are going into what happens, and some of those possibilities are pretty devastating.
And you know, I want to talk to layer that over culture, and you can correct me if I'm wrong, because I'm trying to understand it too. One of the things that Governor Gretchen Whitmer said in Michigan is that when you see these big protests and these guys coming in with their AR-15s, they're generally coming from rural areas. They're not in the urban, they're not living in Lansing.
Sure.
And so they're bringing that back to rural areas. And so you look at the spread of disease based on kind of culture and movements. In Italy, for example, I heard that it was very hard to get families to stop gathering, even when they were, you know, this disease was becoming more and more apparent, and the devastation that it caused. Grandparents didn't want to stop seeing their kids and their grandkids. They continued to want to hug them, and there was a cultural emphasis on being together. Now, I heard in Scandinavian countries, and this is funny, I think you'll think it's funny because David's Norwegian. Scandinavian countries, the joke is, you know, we were told we had to.
She's Swedish.
I'm Swedish. We were told we had to stay 6 feet apart. We can't wait to go back to normal so we can be 15 feet apart.
Right.
And so I wonder if part of it is, you know, I mean, again, I don't want to put any generalization over things. Certainly people are different in different cultures, but they're different types of cultural relationships with each other that may play into contagion.
Yeah. This is a really big, interesting experiment, and the entire planet Earth is the petri dish.
Right. Scott, before we started, mentioned something about a colleague of his jumping into a Zoom session and playing tic-tac-toe. And I'm doing that now, bouncing back and forth between one side of this conversation to the other. So back to the history side for a second. I think I've got 3 X's in a row now, so I think that might make me a winner. But how would you, Betsy, describe the, I guess, connection between the vision of life held by the Mormon people that are associated with the Bundys and mainstream Mormonism? Now, 150 years ago, or 140 years ago, 130, that was it. There was one thing, right? Are they?
No, I think
much in common?
That's a really important question. And I kind of have 2 answers to that. Number one, the Bundys have now really network with broader militia circles. So it's not just Mormon militia. It's actually, I mean, they're connected to the 3%ers. They're connected to the Proud Boys that we're seeing in Michigan. You know, when they had the standoff, there were people from all over the country that came to Nevada. There were fewer people that came to Oregon because of the reasons I said before. It was really, it seemed muddled, and there were a number of militia sort of head honchos that said, we're not going to stand with you on this, especially because the Hammond family, which was the reason they were there, said, we don't want you to do this. Now, in terms of the Mormon Church, or the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, they have come out and said, we do not support the Bundys using scripture to justify their actions, because in Malheur they really were talking about, you know, Ryan said, for example, something to the effect, and I'm paraphrasing, I've never felt more Mormon. That this is the most Mormon thing I've ever done by the occupation. And yeah, which is I quote that in my book. And so, you know, the Mormon Church has come out and said, no, this is not about being Mormon. But I was on a program a couple of days ago with this really wonderful guy named Richie Stedman, who is a Mormon. And he asked me, why haven't the Bundys been excommunicated? And I wonder about that too. I mean, I really am curious about that. Why haven't they been excommunicated? And it's my feeling that the Mormon Church has distanced themselves from the Bundys by issuing these comments, but there's still a very big interest in Zion and land and Utah, in managing Utah. This is sacred Mormon homeland. They don't want the government managing their public lands. The Mormon state, the state of Mormon, the state of Utah has been one of the most, you know, the state that's been pushing back on the federal government and restrictions, environmental restrictions. They've been pushing for states' rights. They want to manage these lands, and it's in part, in my belief, that it goes back to this you know, this entitlement. This is their land.
The People's Republic of Zion.
Well, or Deseret, which is the idea of the Mormon Empire. So that's a complicated issue, and so yeah, yeah, it's something that I continue to scratch my head over.
Yeah, it's a tough one. Speaking of tough questions, here's a tough one, flipping to the person to your right. David, could you move back a little bit? There's supposed to be some social, thank you.
I live with this. This is my all the time, and now I can't even leave the house.
So sorry.
So David, the person who identified the mandrel, I mentioned her name earlier, Jenna Hickey. You met her in Kinshasa in 2011 with bonobo work or something.
Oh yeah. Oh, Jenna. Okay. Yes. Yeah. Okay. I spent 10 days. We all spent 10 days in a hotel in Kinshasa at a bonobo workshop.
6 feet apart from each other the whole time.
And I keep wondering what happens when this virus hits Kinshasa. Anyway, Jenna, what is there a question?
Yeah, there's a question of in places. To what extent do you think? So places like Wyoming and Montana, relatively rural, and I think through that feature and also a certain amount of good luck. I mean, here in Laramie, if our spring break had been a week earlier or a week later, just relative to the onset of the virus, we'd be hurting a whole lot more. So good luck plays a role in it too. But to what extent do you think that in places that did get hit harder, faster, they could have avoided the wreckage, I guess, morbidity and mortality, had the response to it started 2 or 3 weeks earlier?
Yeah, good question.
New York City, for example.
Yeah, good question, Jenna. Well, I don't know much about New York City, but obviously that's a huge case. And so I will need to learn more about what happened early on, the decisions that were made. I have a little bit better sense, but only beginning. of the decisions that were made, for instance, in Singapore, in the Republic of Korea. I think Italy was plastered, was hammered, particularly northern Italy, Lombardy, early on. And I know a lot about, well, I have a sense of that because I've been spending a lot of time doing media with newspapers and TV in Italy. This is really devastating to them, and my book is conspicuous there. So I've been talking with a lot of Italian people. What happened in Italy? Why did Italy get hit so hard so early? I think they were unlucky. I think that probably what happened is that a number of silent spreaders came in through the Milan airport to Lombardy, to their various industrial facilities and maybe some of their artistic attractions in northern Italy. And before anyone really knew what this virus could do, I think these silent spreaders had a lot of contacts. So suddenly the virus was there, widespread in the communities, and then it was exacerbated by a couple of factors. The one that Betsy mentioned, the fact that social distancing from elders is not part of the ethic in Italy, especially northern Italy. These are multi-generational families. They're very close. They're very loving. They're very physical. That may have worked to the detriment. Also, there's a lot of air pollution in northern Italy because of the industry there. And I've got a paper lying on my desk here amidst this huge pile of papers that I need to read that talks about the importance of air pollution, particulate aerosols, in increasing people's jeopardy to this virus. Those things, I think, happened in Italy. France, Spain, I have no idea. Brazil, I have no idea, but I want to find out. Why is it so bad in Brazil and in the Democratic Republic of the Congo? I'm knocking on wood. It has hardly shown itself so far. I don't know. This is a mysterious virus. Anybody who says, woo-ha, we're past the worst of it, we should open our economies now and gather in the bars and restaurants, doesn't appreciate what a subtle, dangerous virus this is. And it's with us. It's everywhere among human populations now. We're going to see how it plays out. It's not going away soon. I think that 40 years from now, people will be vaccinated against this virus, assuming that we get a vaccine, which I think we will. 40 years from now, people will still be vaccinated against this virus, and it will still be killing people in pockets around the world, like measles does.
Or flu or others, yeah, you bet.
There's a really interesting question in the chat that I would love to answer, and I'm sorry, it just popped up. So I know that there's others before that. And we'll get to those. We'd be happy to.
Go for it.
But what would the Bundys think of New Zealand virtually eliminating the virus due to the comprehensive lockdown? And also, do they understand that the founding fathers they revere, created the Constitution, they worship, or they came out of it? Essentially, they were influenced by the Enlightenment, and so I have
two questions, two very distinct questions.
Number one, I think New Zealand. There are a couple of reasons why I think that it would make them.
Either of you need a pair of socks or a shoe or something?
Yeah, he's really helpful in dressing us. But I think that New Zealand would horrify them. Number one, the fact that they're restricting liberties, the fact that people can't make their own decisions about wearing masks or staying at home. They'd see it as such an affront to their liberties.
Totally different culture.
They would be mortified that there weren't enough guns. I mean, one of the things that we've seen is that this disease and these stay-at-home restrictions have this idea that it's been conflated with the Second Amendment. You're taking away our rights, so we're going to bring guns to our protests to show you that we can carry guns. It's crazy.
What the hell does the Second Amendment have to do with this issue?
And so this has all been a constitutional
Why do you have to wear an AR-15 around your neck?
Exactly, and you refuse to wear a mask to keep other people safe. So there's a craziness that Americans have. The Bundys are one manifestation of that. But I will answer your founding fathers question, because this is really interesting. I am thinking about this a lot right now because I'm playing with an idea for my next book and thinking about anti-science and thinking about the family or the founding fathers really being inspired by the Enlightenment and for their warts. And I will absolutely say that there were many warts with our founding fathers. And I'll go back to the New Zealand thing. The Bundys are patriarchal. They would not be cool with a woman leader. So that's another reason. But
the president of New Zealand.
Yes, yeah.
Or prime minister.
Prime minister, who's amazing.
Prime minister.
But the other thing is when I talked to Cliven about the Constitution, he said Jesus wrote the Constitution. So they don't really think about Enlightenment and the founding fathers being inspired by ideas of Enlightenment. It's a very different way of thinking.
Did Jesus write Amazing Grace?
Maybe he can help you. Maybe he can help you with your software development.
Yeah, exactly. But anyway, so that's what you're sort of coming up against when you try, and it goes back to Ken's question, like, what is their great plan? There's so many sort of quirky, not well thought out ideas that no, they wouldn't be critical thinkers in the way that you are asking them to be.
Yes, I totally agree. I know I hope you have more questions, Ken.
I've got a couple more, sure, but keep on.
Before we run out of time, I want to say that I think one of the important things about this that I'd like to get into the conversation is that this is really a huge crisis for the democracies of planet Earth, far beyond the impacts, as dire as they are, of COVID-19. This is a crisis of factuality versus preferred stories, of science versus anti-science, of the Constitution versus the charismatic leader. I think we're in a really serious crisis here, and we have to sort out the fact that we've got two very different factions of our society, at least in this country, that are saying, well, it's not just a matter of my opinion versus your opinion. It's the matter of, you say you have these facts and they are backed up by science, but I have my own facts and they are backed up by the sources that I prefer, the sources that I trust.
Well, I would even go further than that, or well, it's probably exactly what you're saying, but one of the things that I've seen amidst this proliferation of misinformation and conspiracy and anti-science is this idea that when you say, well, here's a peer-reviewed study, and that's not plandemic, which I don't know if you all have seen or heard about this plandemic, which is just absolute utter rubbish. And so somebody will say, well, I believe plandemic because I believe that Fauci tried to muzzle this woman, and I don't even know what her name is.
Judy Mikovits.
And you'll say, well, actually, that's not true. Here's a peer-reviewed paper, and she's been disgraced, and blah, blah, blah.
But it's smoothly packaged.
But let me just finish
well
that, the point, which is people say, well, you're entitled to your opinion. When did facts become opinion? Like, how has that been shell gamed into this, where you have a peer-reviewed? I mean, we don't.
David, your mouth.
I know, we can't even agree on what's real, because I'm entitled to my opinion, not to believe facts.
Yes.
I mean, it's a muddle.
Yes. Yeah.
There are larger forces in play that drive this too. I think the fact that there are 8 billion of us and that resources are hugely, grossly not shared equally.
Absolutely.
Yeah,
that leaves people
despair.
desperately frightened for their future and their children's future and their children's future, and that just motivates all of this. I think a fear, a very existential fear that's not unrealistic, is behind all of these tough moments.
Yeah.
Here's a question from Pamela. Is it okay to look at the chat?
Totally.
Okay.
Pam's question's a good one.
A good one for you.
That's for you, David. Do you need some specs?
Yeah, thank you. Thank you.
Here, if you needed your bike shoe, Manny brought it to you.
We have my bike shoe. Where's Pamela's question?
So her question is related to
in some states, such as Ohio, 98% of the deaths were in prisons, 20%, and nursing homes, 78%. Could you comment on statistics such as these? Yes, I can comment in one word: deplorable. Further words: ridiculous, unjust, outrageous. Heartbreaking. The fact that most of the deaths are in prisons and nursing homes means that we are consigning our confined elements of the population to death from this virus while we go and party on beaches in Florida and New Jersey.
And don't
it's
forget,
ridiculous.
Well, and it's a race issue too. I mean, African Americans are dying.
African Americans
and
African Americans in nursing homes are dying at higher rates than white people in nursing homes.
Well, and African Americans that are essential workers, bus drivers. It's an awful. Yeah. It's a disease that's really uncovering our racism as well.
Yeah,
definitely exposing the underbelly.
Yeah. And in our healthcare, I mean, African Americans die more.
Yeah.
Or they're not given the treatment that
the people who are saying, it doesn't seem bad in my peer group. My buddies and I and our girlfriends are gathering at the bar and we feel fine. What's the deal? Why should we wear masks? And meanwhile, as Pamela says, all these people are dying in these disadvantageous situations where they're crowded together and they can't avoid transmission, and the virus is there. Ladies and gentlemen, the virus is there. The virus is here. Wherever you are, the virus is there.
Well, and I read this really interesting article today, and I think it was from an epidemiologist at Yale that said, you might be really good and you're only meeting with one neighbor, and that one neighbor has a kid who has a girlfriend who snuck out, and that girlfriend's mother had the day before touched something that, and so when you are just meeting with one person, and not social distancing, you have no idea how many people you're actually exposing yourself to. Yeah. It's insidious.
We have this think and drink business. We have traditionally wrapped them up at about the hour and a quarter point, and we're moving in on it. And so, David, you earlier mentioned the point that this is like what this country experienced in the late 60s and early 71 period of civil unrest and foment, and there was violence then and people dying, and Betsy, you're speaking to this energy from the current moment, coming from the I'll say the right-wing side, the militia side, and David's comment about people not appreciating the depth of. Do you think there's any chance that this moment could turn into 10 years from now, be seen as a moment in our culture in this country, a moment of change? I hope, I pray for the good.
I do. And I have to say, of the two of us, I'm the most pessimistic. I feel like we are now seeing everything tumble. We are recognizing the fact that we were unprepared for pandemic. We're seeing these great these great injustices. We're seeing the have-nots and haves, and how this disease is impacting it. We're seeing, in addition to this, social unrest that is, again, the George Floyd and the Christian Cooper, it's all tumbling in on us at the same time. The what Donald Trump is doing, this lack of compassion, this lack of leadership, everything is in front of us right now. Everything that's broken. We were so unprepared for this because of so many different reasons. And I think that it's going to galvanize people. I don't know how long it'll take, but I feel like we're at a moment where people are becoming aware that where we are right now is because of terrible, awful decisions and a way of running this country that has been a terrible on so many levels. So I do think this is a galvanizing moment.
I hope it is too, and I think Trump, for all his appallingness, is a symptom and not a cause of the problems that we have now. And those problems involve us in this country, having neglected the working people for 40 or 50 years who have not come along on the increase in standards of living. And now they are angry and confused and desperate and grasping for autocratic heroes.
And for millennials and for young people who don't have the opportunities that.
Yeah. But I think that it's desperately important now that that this become an opportunity for us to realize that this has to do with the way we're treating one another and the way we're treating the natural world, and we're doing a bad job on both of those things.
Yeah, and we haven't even mentioned climate change, which is, as soon as that's the next thing we're going to be dealing with, which again exposes all the things that we've just talked about,
right?
These disparities and these cracks.
And that's part of what I think of as the big three problems we have: climate change, the threat of pandemic, and loss of biological diversity. Yeah. And all of those things are caused by the size of the human population and the rate of consumption of the human population.
Agreed.
And so that involves our decisions as voters and our decisions as individuals, how many children we have, if we choose to have any children at all. And even if you have one child, that doesn't mean you can determine how many grandchildren you have, how much you travel,
Americans are the ones who have the biggest
consumption.
American kids.
So that we are, then what you're both saying is we are at a moment of a climactic moment. Of course, it's not going to disappear in a week or two or a month or two, that you both have reason to hope is going to turn into something good. If we, as to use, I think Betsy's words, we galvanize ourselves into personal choices, David, and political choices that help make the world better. And I think I'll end this conversation on that hopeful note. I thank you both very much for taking this time. I thank all of you who have been listening and commenting and conversing with us for being here. This is Wyoming Institute of Humanities Research Think and Drink. I'm apparently done drinking, so I'm also done thinking. And we'll sign off with that. And thank you again. And
thank you
David
for
and Betsy.
Us. We really, really appreciated this. We love doing this together. And we loved it and we love doing it with University of Wyoming. I really, Ken and Scott, thank you, and all the people who tuned in.
It's absolutely true. Say goodnight, Gracie.
Good night, Gracie.
And you two stick around. We'll rejoin with Scott when the recording's done.
Great.
Thank you.
Bye, everybody. Good night. Stay safe.
Thank you. Thank you for being with us tonight. Thank you. Thank you. And also you. And also you.